Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum.
Look, it's real easy to stand up on the Senate floor and say, you're never going to have to pay taxes again, free recess for everybody, and ice cream on Fridays, right? I mean, at the end of the day, you have to balance a budget, and you have to provide services to people in this state. And I would wish a lot of these Republicans, especially the ones that live in the rural areas, would look at some of their communities that are suffering because of that attitude.
Missouri Democrats are in the minority in both the House and the Senate, but Senate Democrats have much more power to affect the flow of legislation, thanks to the chamber's tradition of a strong filibuster and divides within the Senate GOP. Now, with the Senate winding down, Senate Democrats are preparing for big fights over the state budget and renewing a critical tax paying for the state's Medicaid program. Joining us now is Senate Minority Leader John Rizzo. Rizzo represents Missouri's 11th senatorial district, which includes parts of Jackson County. Senator, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for having me.
So, as I'm sure you know, there were very low expectations for session this year, primarily because it's an election year, and there are pressures around that, and there was palpable infighting within the Senate GOP last year and this year. Do you think the legislature managed to do anything to exceed those dire expectations?
I would argue not thus far, but I'm on the opposite page of this. I think there's a lot of time left in session, man. I mean, Jason, you've been around these sessions a long time.
Yes, I have.
And that last week of session, a lot can happen. So, we'll see what happens in the lead up to that. But as far as I'm concerned, in my 14 years this far out, there's still a lot of time for a lot of things to happen.
So there was one thing that passed this week that was very significant, and this was a wide-ranging education bill that was sent to Governor Parson. It features a lot of things your caucus doesn't like the expansion of a tax credit program that could provide private school scholarships. But it did manage to get through the Senate, I think, without a major filibuster. Why do you think this was able to make it through the process, given that quote-unquote education reform has always had a hard time getting off the ground?
Sure. I just think that when we sat down and we worked the details out of the deal, and Senator Arthur and some staff members did just an amazing job with it, we were able to secure a lot of good things for public education. And while for the Democrats in the Senate, it was hard for us to vote yes on it because of the vouchers and Boone County charter school expansion, there was still a ton of stuff in there for public education, as well as teacher pay raises and encouragement of the 5-day school week, which is a big deal in Independence, Missouri, and things like that. I couldn't vote for it. I don't think none of the Senate Dems ended up voting for it, but I don't besmirch anybody that did.
I think one of the criticisms that I heard in the House is that a lot of the funding for things like, boosting teacher pay is subject to appropriation, and it may not actually materialize. I'm sure you heard those arguments. Do you think that they hold water?
Not really. I mean, I think that at the end of the day, it is something that we'll be able to track from here on out. And so if they decide to not fund it, we'll be able to know what happens. Look, there wasn't a world where we love this bill. There's stuff in it to like, there's stuff in it to hate, and that's part of a good compromise. It's tremendously difficult when the Senate Pro Tem is from Boone County and has all the tools of the trade to sort of get a bill through the Senate that he's been working on, quite honestly, for years. So we were in a tough situation fighting uphill when you have the Senate Pro Tem's priority, something that he's worked on for a long time that he wants to get through. We tried to shoot him some of our wish list, and sure enough, it came back. There was a ton of things that they were willing to give up to get this stuff done, and at that point, we decided to let the bill go, even though we couldn't really vote for it.
So there's still a lot to get done, despite the aforementioned, shot that I gave about the low expectations, including reauthorizing the federal reimbursement allowance, which is a tax hospitals place upon themselves to fund the state's Medicaid program. I know it's been intertwined with this other bill that is trying to steer state money away from Planned Parenthood, and I think that bill is stuck in the House. Do you see this FRA impasse being cleared before May 17th?
That's the $4.5 billion question. Honestly, I know Senator Huff was taking a pretty strong stance that he wasn't going to go into markup until it was resolved. I think that they have decided to go ahead and do that next week, which I think is continuing progress. But I don't know. I mean, that's going to be up to the Freedom Caucus, and that's going to be up to the Republican leadership and how far they're willing to go in order to maintain funding in the healthcare system to the tune of $4.5 billion, which dramatically affects rural Missouri's healthcare system.
I know this is kind of an odd question, but if you can't get this done by May 17th for some reason, could you see a situation where Democrats and Republicans join together to previous question this bill, which for our listeners would be to end a filibuster? And I don't think Democrats have ever joined Republicans to PQ anything in the state's history. But this seems pretty important. You're talking about over $4 billion. It seems like this at desperate times calls for desperate measures situation.
Yeah, I mean, let's call it what it is. I mean, that's the nuclear option, right? I mean, that is the place where nobody ever wants to go, right? That's the thing that keeps Caleb and myself, the Senate Pro Tem and the floor leader and myself talking all the time, is because we never want to have to use anything like that against one another or join together to use it against anybody else. So I can tell you right now, there has not been any serious talks about that at all. I don't feel like we would be in any position at this point to begin to talk about shutting down debate. It's happened to me while I was there. Senator Hageman moved the previous question on the issue of the minimum wage increase. It was mass chaos. There was a lot of hard feelings afterwards. And if, in fact, that measure's taken, I could pretty well assure you that session is over. And next year will probably be affected as well.
On the budget, which the Senate needs to create its own version, you probably have heard a lot of arguments from people like State Senator Bill Eigel, a Republican from Weldon Spring, who's talking about how the budget is too big and it's an example of like state government spending being out of control. What do you make of that argument? Because I think if you get the FRA impasse done, you then have to pass the budget. And I'm sure you're going to hear that argument a lot from the aforementioned Freedom Caucus, which is like a group of Republican senators who agitate pretty openly against GOP leadership in the Senate.
Yeah, I mean, look, they continue to rabble-rouse on whatever issue it is. Most of the time, the things that they accuse and talk about are things like cutting the budget to draconian levels, but then don't offer a way to do that without sacrificing public service like police and firefighters and roads and bridges. Look, it's real easy to stand up on the Senate floor and say, you're never going to have to pay taxes again, free recess for everybody, and ice cream on Fridays. Right? I mean, at the end of the day, you have to balance a budget and you have to provide services to people in this state. And I would wish a lot of these Republicans, especially the ones that live in the rural areas, would look at some of their communities that are suffering because of that attitude. Right? The people in rural Missouri that can't get roads and bridges paved or built, that have a tough time accessing health care, that have a tough time being able to see any sort of medical professional. They espouse these beliefs because it gets them votes while their citizens and their constituents suffer.
The other thing that is left undone that's kind of looming in the background is a measure that, if passed by the legislature, would go to voters to make the Constitution more difficult to amend. And it seems that the House has placed things like banning non-citizens from voting back in there after it was taken out of the Senate. How do you see that entire what proponents call IP reform ending? Do you think the legislature will put something on the ballot, or is this something that just may fizzle out after a lot of hue and cry and attention on it for the last few years?
Yeah, I mean, this. I've had a lot of questions about this, honestly, and this is pretty simple for us. If it has ballot candy and comes back to the Senate, we intend to fully filibuster as long as we possibly can, so that people can have an honest look at what it is. If they choose to pick it up in the House and take the ballot candy off and put it on the ballot, then that's a fair fight, and that's kind of what we wanted. That's all we always said, is all we wanted was a fair fight. And they go in there and they put all this stuff in about immigrants and voting and all of these hyperbolic things, most of which, by the way, are already illegal by Constitution or state law, just so people get confused and they end up voting against one thing or another instead of what's really happening, and that's raising the threshold on getting something in the Constitution and taking people's voice away.
So I think that there's no question that this is being pushed because there's also a ballot campaign to try to legalize abortion in the state. We don't know if it has enough signatures. And I talked with Secretary of State Jay Ashcroft yesterday. Their office told me that they're not planning on using what's called random sampling at this time, but Ashcroft said no decision has been officially made about whether they're going to do that. And that could potentially mean if they have enough signatures, it could go in August as opposed to November. Is there a feeling among abortion rights supporters about when they would prefer it to go on the ballot? Because I've heard pros and cons either way.
Yeah, look, I think at the end of the day, it's just about getting it on the ballot. Obviously, I think more people are able to weigh in November. That's just usually traditionally how elections work. More people vote in a presidential November election than they do in an August primary. Having said that, I'm fully confident that whatever month they put it on, whenever they ask the people how they feel about it, overwhelming support will be for women restoring rights over their bodies.
I think that especially nationally, there's been a lot of discussion about the political impact of ballot initiatives that protect abortion rights. But I've also heard from people it's kind of a double-edged sword for Democrats. It's a way for getting policies over the finish line, but it kind of gives voters that don't like certain Republican policies, but they like others, kind of an out where they can like pick and choose issues, but still vote for Republicans. What do you think about that phenomenon? Because that's been theorized that like people thinking that if this is on in November, Democrats are going to win everything has they kind of temper the expectations based off that theory.
Yeah, and this honestly goes back to the whole IP and initiative petition debate. If they make it harder to put things on the ballot that we've seen, like marijuana and everything else like that, they're going to start changing the legislature. And I have cautioned every Republican that is pushing this initiative petition reform to make the threshold higher to allow people to change the Constitution. I have cautioned Republicans, you be careful because that's your outlet, right? That's the thing that allows them to go around the legislature. And if they can't do that and they can't go around the legislature, they're going to start changing the legislature. Well, as a Democrat who's been in the super minority for 14 years now, I am very hopeful that someday they will change the legislature and give Democrats an opportunity to govern again in this state so that we can show them how governing really works.
Senator John Rizzo is a Democrat from Independence and the Senate Minority Leader. Senator Rizzo, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Jason.
When we come back, we'll talk with a representative from a group seeking to legalize sports betting in Missouri. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
This episode was produced by Jason Rosenbaum.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, saluting Earth Day on April 22nd with an ongoing commitment to help offset carbon emissions with sustainable harvesting of Missouri forests. Details at choosewood.com.